George Baumgarten, correspondent for Jewish newspapers. You mentioned on page 53 that there is a mountain of human rights reports, and you do not on that page mention anything about the accusations against Hamas of abusing their own civilians.
Okay. There is a question that was raised having to do with the human rights reports about how much value to attach to the testimony of the Palestinians who were interviewed by people like Mr. Goldstone and his mission, because after all, it was in Gaza. Gaza is controlled by Hamas, and aren't we then to reasonably infer that the testimony is going to be in some way tainted because of Hamas intimidation or fear of Hamas? Now, the Goldstone report did say that there were hesitations among the Palestinian civilian population in its testimonies. However, you have to take into account the following facts. Number one, as Amnesty International put it, I won't quote because it'll be distracting. If you read the human rights reports, especially the Goldstone report, there is a huge amount devoted to Palestinian Hamas abuses, torture, and killing of opposition members and often not opposition members during those 22 days. That is to say, the Palestinians did testify against Hamas actions during those 22 days. The Goldstone report devotes probably as many as 30 pages to pretty harrowing testimonies of Palestinians in Gaza against Hamas. And so Amnesty International, which also addressed the question, it said that the Palestinian civilian population in Gaza was not so intimidated by Hamas that they were afraid to attack Hamas very openly for the crimes they committed during the Gaza massacre against other Palestinians in Gaza. So it's just not true that the Palestinian civilians were intimidated and fearful of criticizing Hamas. They attacked Hamas very vigorously, and that vigorous testimony is reported in the human rights reports. Bear in mind, I said Human Rights Watch published 5 reports on Gaza. One of those 5 was devoted to Hamas violation of human rights of other Palestinians during the attack. Where did Human Rights Watch get its information? It got its information from Palestinians in Gaza testifying against Hamas. But there was one thing no human rights organization found. Human Rights Watch investigated it, Amnesty International investigated it, the Goldstone report investigated it, namely the question of human shielding by Hamas. Allow me just one brief paragraph. I'm quoting to you now from Amnesty. Contrary to reported allegations by Israeli officials of the use of human shields, Amnesty International found no evidence that Hamas or other Palestinian fighters directed the movement of civilians to shield military objectives from attacks. Amnesty International found no evidence that Hamas or other armed groups forced residents to stay in or around buildings used by fighters. Amnesty International found no evidence that fighters prevented residents from leaving buildings or areas which had been commandeered by militants. Even though Palestinian civilians were very willing to testify against Hamas for its abuses, its violations of human rights, and very gruesome violations of human rights, no question about it, none of them said Hamas engaged in human shielding. It just didn't happen.
Nizar.
Yeah, you spoke about deterrence, and Israel wanted to restore its deterrence in Gaza. Since Israel is receiving the state-of-the-art weaponry from all over the West, not just from the United States, what kind of deterrence they wanted to restore?
Well, the issue for Israel was they used this technical term. The technical term they use is deterrence capacity. The deterrence capacity is just a fancy word. Ariel Sharon in June 1967, when Israel again wanted to restore its deterrence capacity, not against Ahmadinejad, but against Nasser of Egypt, he says that we have to attack, Ariel Sharon said, we have to attack to restore our deterrence capacity. And then he said, the Arab world's fear of us. And that's always been a major concern for the Israelis, preserving that deterrence capacity. Now in July, August 2006, when Israel attacked Lebanon, it did suffer a major military setback there. And along came this fellow named Mr. Nasrallah, and he kept rubbing the Israeli nose into the ground after the attack. He kept saying, the Arabs are no longer afraid of Israel. We're not afraid of the Israelis. Let them attack, and we'll defeat them again. Let them attack. We'll defeat them again. Now for Israel, this became a huge problem. It was losing its deterrence capacity. For reasons which time doesn't allow me now, they decided they were going to restore their deterrence capacity in Gaza. But they had one big problem in Gaza. The big problem was they knew that Hamas had no fighting force. As a fighting force, it was a zero, an empty set. So how do you restore your deterrence capacity against an enemy which has no military capacity? They knew that simply a military victory was not going to restore their deterrence capacity in the Arab world, because Hamas is not a military force. And so they decided the way to restore their deterrence capacity was to systematically and methodically go after the civilian infrastructure and civilian population, and thereby transmit the message to the Arab world: if you mess with us, we're not going to have a war with you. We're going to flatten you, like we flattened Gaza. And the Israelis were very open about that. They said, we decided to act like a mad dog. We decided to show Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran that we were just as capable as them of acting in a lunatic fashion.